I want it to be super kind of practical. So what would be really helpful in the chat, if you're able to just list to give me the ages of your children, that would be that would be quite helpful, so that I can try and tailor the conversation a little bit more in those sort of specific areas. And I think the title is deliberately provocative for this particular talk. Okay, right, we've got a big range here in terms of teens all the way down to little e. So that's good, and I can address. We're going to have questions after question and answer session, so I'll be able to answer some specific things for you as well. As I said, the title's deliberately slightly provocative, but I think before we sort of start to get into the meat of what do we do when our children make poor choices, I think it's important to kind of, whether we use the word punishment, whether we talk about consequence, whatever it is, I think it's taking a step back and actually thinking, what is our role, in terms of whatever mechanism that we use to help our children make better choices in the first place. And so the reason why I don't like this idea about punishment is that in itself, it does not instruct children. It doesn't teach them anything. It simply creates something that is punitive because they've made a poor choice. And I'm always thinking, I think it's quite a helpful mechanism to think about, is almost work with the end in mind. So if we want to raise resilient, confident adults who are fully functioning in society, can hold down a job, have a means of a home, whatever that looks like. So if that's the end goal, when we then reflect back, for me, punishments don't get us along that path. They don't teach them, but consequences do. Because other than the fact that if we physically break the law, we are generally in life, we're not punished as adults, but we do experience consequences. If we're not prepared for a meeting, the meeting doesn't go particularly well. If we don't hit a deadline, then that might have a consequence in terms of the impact on our colleagues and or the impact on our career progression and or management view of us. So it's very much, how can we recreate the adult world that our children are going to navigate at some point in terms of what we do within the home. And so that's why I think consequences are a much more instructive way of going about helping our children make different choices. It doesn't make it any easier. It just, I think when we reframe that, it's helpful. The other thing I would say, and we're probably all guilty of this, and it's happened, and I am guilty probably more than anyone, is that when our children do something and we're supremely frustrated with them, we find ourselves often, when we're delivering a punishment, it tends to be off the cuff and pretty severe because we're just so angry and frustrated. So when we can really reframe from that perspective of consequence, it has a big, big impact. So what I'm going to just want to talk through is some of the things that I would recommend you don't do, some of the things I would recommend that you do, and then I'm going to talk through a couple of particular strategies that are really helpful. One of the things that we do, and I'm saying this with love as a fellow parent, but one of the things that we do, I believe, as parents, that loses the impact of the consequence is we tend to use a lot of words. Children don't need all those extra words. They just simply need to understand that they've made a poor choice. So what we're looking at doing is helping our children understand that every choice they make in behaviour has a consequence. And sometimes those consequences are positive consequences, and sometimes those consequences are going to be less than positive. For example, if your child helps unpack the dishwasher, if they sit down and get on with their homework, for those of you that have got older children, if they do go up to bed when we ask them, or go up to have a bath when we ask them, there is a positive consequence to that choice, because either we praise them, we may reward them, it may well be that they get more of our time, whatever that might be. So we're looking at what do we do about the choices that they make that are not so fit. So they faff around for 45 minutes before they go up to bed. They don't unpack the dishwasher. We get into constant battles about them sitting down and doing their work. Or whatever that might be, that's where we're trying to make some of those changes. So let's do the don'ts. So the first don't that I would say is avoid long lectures. They're not helpful. Children and teens very quickly tune out of long lectures. And because quite often, if you think about it, when we find ourselves in terms of that long lecture point, we've become so exasperated. Sorry. We've become so exasperated that we're losing impact as to what it is particularly that we want to talk to our children about. So I will talk you through how we might replace that, but I would definitely avoid long lectures. Avoid too many words. So, for example, I don't know whether you have come across this. You've all got different ages of children. The usual sort of, you come into your child's bedroom or maybe an area that they've been playing, and we do the whole like, oh my goodness me, how many times have I told you to pick up your things? I can't even see the carpet for the number of clothes that are on the floor, or there's toys everywhere. So we get into this long rant because we're frustrated, and quite often, we're having a conversation about consequences and punishment, which means these are not one-offs. These are things that are often happening again and again. And so that loses the impact. However, if we go in with a much shorter, succinct, clothes off the floor, really clear what we want, that we've taken the emotion out, we've taken all of that and just simply stated a very clear instructions. Toys go, live in their baskets or in their cupboard, whatever it might be. It's really trying to kind of cut down on the number of words. Do not fear. I will be explaining how you can kind of do that. And then the third thing is, I think we have to manage the tone that we use and the emotion that is that comes behind that, so that we can be much more factual and very direct and very succinct in terms of what we are asking our children to do, because asking them to tune into only a few words rather than a very long stream of language. So those are my encourage you not to do. What I would encourage you to do from a do, and obviously you've come to this, you'll all have slightly different challenges that you're facing particularly, or tools that you want to have, but around specific behaviours, is that for some, it will take some time to encourage our children to make better choices in those moments. So rather than seeing it as a binary, my child is not doing X and it's really problematic and I need some advice and some tips on how I need to change that, is instead reframing it as my child is currently making these choices, and this is the challenge that I've got. What skills may I need to equip them with so that they can make better choices? And along the way, because it's not going to go from they don't do it to doing it, there's going to be a transition, there's going to be a period of learning and changing, is that we reframe how we see that behavior and actively seek out moments where we can, we're not going to do it all of the time, but moments where they're making some progress to making better choices. So they may still leave their clothes everywhere, but you may get a glimmer that maybe there's 10% less on the floor, or they've picked something up on one particular day. So it's really actively reframing the scenario to, there is going to be a transitionary period, and every time I see them making some progress, I am going to praise them in that moment, because that has two effects. First is, obviously everyone likes a bit of praise, nice bit of stroking, told that they've done a brilliant job. The second part is, if we can be really explicit in our description about why we are praising them. I'm so impressed that you cleared that particular part of your bedroom. I'm so impressed that I could see that you were getting really frustrated with your brother. And I know in the end you pushed him over, but I could see that you were really trying not to, and it took a few moments. You composed yourself, but then you got frustrated. The beauty about the second bit, the way that you describe what it is that they have done that you are pleased with, is that is so much more powerful than all of the nagging and the lecturing that we do about how many times have I told you you need to do X and Y? Because it's framed within a really clear narrative of this behavior and this is exactly what you did, and I'm impressed with. So it bumps up. And in my experience, they sort of grow slightly 2 feet taller because they feel like, oh, and then you usually find that because, when you've been really clear, that they will quite often then deliberately try and find other scenarios that they can show up in that way. So definitely, really try and encourage you to praise the bits that you do manage to see. The other thing that I found that is really powerful is our random rewards. Now, some of you may well find that for your children, the sort of sticker chart or the if you do X, then you get Y mechanism works. My reticence with that particular strategy for some children, for some it works brilliantly and it can be very short and sharp. My reticence is that for some, you'll find yourself as the stakes get higher and you do more, they're expecting that there's a constant negotiation for, well, I'll only do this if you give me that. You're getting into that sort of thing. And so what I find is much more powerful. And actually, it means that you can control it in lots of ways. So you don't have this preemptive, I'll give you this if you do that, is much more this notion of random rewards. So you choose a moment, child exhibits some particular behavior. Maybe they do make a better choice, or you can see that they're working really hard to make a good choice. Then the random reward is, Tom, I'm so impressed with the fact that you came in straight away from school, and rather than complain about your homework, you just sat down and you got started. I'm so impressed with that. Why not? I think we'll have a little bit of extra time together. You can stay up late. You can have a bit of time on a device. You can, I don't know, have extra ice cream for dessert because I know that that's your favorite. Whatever it is, those random rewards can speak massive volumes because it comes from absolutely nowhere. And you are then able to describe what it is that you really liked about their behavior. That consolidates. They know what their expectations are. And it's a really lovely feeling. What I would say often with rewards is that children generally value time more than things. And usually that time is with us in some shape or form. For my children, it was always being able to stay up that little bit later, even if it was 15 minutes. That was just like, that's so amazing. But you will know what the rewards are for your particular child. What are the things that really work for them? So I would encourage you to look at things like random rewards. And then when we then start looking at how do we then change, what are the do's that we do around consequences? So these are some classic examples, and I don't know whether this will specifically resonate with you because it depends on, we've got children ranging in age. So this might not necessarily be something that is happening with the younger children, but a scenario might be that your child, maybe they're rude, maybe they are being a bit defiant, maybe they don't do something that you've asked them, maybe they're just being challenging in a particular behavior, and we've asked them 4 or 5 times to do something and then they don't do it. What can often happen is we then find ourselves leveraging whatever it is that child particularly values.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of the time, what that value is often time on electronics or devices. Now, that might not be the same for all of you, but often parents feel that the only leverage that they've got is that they say, right, that's it. You can't have time on your device, whatever that might be. Now, the difficulty with that is, once they've lost that time, what are you going to do next time they do something? And then the second thing is that the consequence that you've just given them has absolutely no relationship to the misdemeanor, to the poor choice that they've made. So the likelihood is that they're going to repeat that pattern of behavior because they haven't learnt that there's a connection between X and Y. So what we ought to be looking at when we're looking at consequences is how close to the misdemeanor can I make this consequence? So if you imagine if your child doesn't, you don't wear a raincoat, if you don't take a coat and you go outside and it rains, you get wet. That's a natural consequence. So we're looking at trying to make the consequence as close as possible. For example, if you're trying to get children to bed and they're procrastinating and they're faffing and you spend 30 to 45 minutes downstairs trying to get them up so that they can have their bath, a natural consequence to that means that they're going to bed that bit later, and therefore maybe you read 2 or 3 bedtime stories, maybe you read a whole book, whatever it might be. A natural consequence is because of the time that has been spent getting you up there, a natural consequence is we've lost that time, and therefore depends how extreme you want to be, and it depends how repeated the behavior is, although I'm going to talk to you about that. Is you could say, well, do you know what, it's not 3 books, we don't have time, I'm afraid, it's just 1 book, or we can't read the full chapter of that book that we're working through, instead we're going to have only a few pages. Or maybe you've got a child who adores leisurely long baths. Well, as a consequence is that we don't have as long. So it's really trying to make that connection. So devices of natural consequences, if a child does not come off their devices when they are asked to, and you spend 20 minutes getting them off, or you're battling around it, then a natural consequence is, well, next time you're on your device, unfortunately, you've lost 20 minutes of your device time. Or it may well be that there is a natural consequence to that. But I don't think we should be leveraging the one thing, whether that's technology, whether that's something else, whether that's a particular activity that your child likes to do, if it doesn't relate to the behavioural choice that they have got. If they are unkind to a sibling, if they break a toy for their siblings, then a natural consequence is that they need to make good in some way. And that make good may well be an apology with younger children. If it's older children who are using siblings' things or being unkind in other ways, then if they're using siblings' things that they've then broken, then a natural consequence is that they need to make good. And making good may well be that they have to dip into their pocket money to replace it, or that we can create some tasks for them to do to earn back what is required to make that, return that particular thing back, or buy an alternative. Or it may well be about making good in terms of possibly even a formal apology, in terms of an apology. We can do a verbal apology, but we can also, for older children, they can write a letter of apology. I think it's about trying to reframe the way that we approach it, so that we are then thinking, how can I make this as close as possible? Now, for some of you, I know you'll be thinking, well, I don't know what it is, Maryhan, if they don't do X, Y, or Z. The podcast does have a free resource library, and it is searchable. So if you go to the website, which is drmaryhan.com, but if you then do /library, in the resource library, I think you have to sign up with your email address. If you search in there for consequences, we have a sheet that we've put in some of the common poor choices, and alongside it some possible consequences that you might want to consider. I mean, I can answer some anyway today, but if you're feeling that it's challenging, it's like, okay, I get it, Maryhan, I understand that it's more instructive to do a consequence, but I have absolutely no idea how I would go about that, then that sheet will do that. So we're looking to try and make sure that the consequence is as close to the misdemeanor as possible. And then the final thing I'm going to do, and then I want to just talk through a particular strategy, is that with punishments, they tend to be us delivering them in the heat of the moment. We don't have an armory of punishments, really. They tend to be emotionally driven. What we can do with consequences, however, is we can have conversations with our children in advance around what might the consequence be. So if we've got let's say a pattern of behavior. So this is the way that I would approach if you've got a pattern of behavior with a child that you are able to have a conversation with. So for those of you with younger children, we'd need to kind of, you'd need to pick and choose various bits because the whole conversation will be a little bit too much for them to really take on board. So let's say we've got a child who is really challenging when it comes to getting them up to bed. Yeah. So maybe they're a procrastinator, maybe they're a faffer, maybe like, oh, well, I just want to do this, or one more this. I don't want to go up to bed. Just take that as an example. So what I would recommend is then having a conversation, not in that moment, but at another time when they're happy, cheerful, maybe a weekend. I've noticed that when it's bedtime, Jack, it's a big challenge. You know, going up to bed takes a really long time. You always want to do one more thing. We then get frustrated because you know that it's that bedtime. We find that we're then getting cross, and it's a really horrible way to go up to bed. Something like that. But what you're really trying to do is start with, it's a non-lecture. It's simply we've noticed this is an objective thing that we have seen that is happening in the evenings. Try to be as clear as you can about what it is that your child is doing repeatedly, but from I'm observing it rather than I'm nagging you and frustrated by it. But also be self-deprecating. Acknowledge your part in how that then ends up becoming a bit of a challenge in the evening, because of course it is going to be jarring and frustrating and irritating. So say that you don't always, you know, how that then makes you feel, and then the consequence of how that transition to what should be a relaxing time to go up to bed then becomes this big frustration. So you've explained the scenario, and then you can go into the much clearer. But we know, you know, bedtime is 7:30, and we can't keep doing things the way that they have been when it comes to going to bed. You then problem solve. How might we make this easier? How might we make bedtime easier? What are the things that we could look at doing? And that becomes a proper family problem solving session. And I think it's really important that children are incredibly good at solving problems. They're much more capable than we give them credit for. But we have to present it in the right way when they're in the right frame of reference. And we then have to have the confidence to be quiet for a few moments so that they can then try to problem solve. We want to encourage them. Now, if you are anything like me and a reforming control enthusiast, who typically jumps in and tells your children, well, I think what we need to do is X, Y, and Z. You may find, and I certainly found this with my children when I started doing this, is that they're so used to you telling them, this is what we're going to do, this is how it's going to be, is that quite often they might find it a bit difficult. It's like, well, I don't know, you tell me. How does bedtime now need to be, Mum? So you can then instead say, look, I know that usually I'm the one that says it, and you might be finding it a bit difficult. How about, and then present them with options. One thing we could do is X, we could try, or we could try Y. Which one do you want to try first? So what we're then doing is we're encouraging them still to make a choice. And what we do know is that when children make choices, they're more, and that helps with a bit of the ownership piece, which means they're much more likely to do that pattern of behavior. So give them choices if your children are not, if they're just not used to being given choices and being, you know, encouraged to problem solve. So we've now said, you know, we've done the whole, I've noticed that bedtime's a challenge. You do this, I do this. How might we make it better? Oh, okay, right. So we're going to do a countdown, or maybe we're now going to change the order in which bath time and other things happen. Whatever it might be, we've now agreed it. So what you then do is you ask your children, okay, so this is obviously the plan and it would be fabulous. That's great. That's what we want to do. But Jack, what's the consequence if it doesn't happen? You know, what is the consequence if you do not go, you know, if you don't basically do whatever we've agreed? And then again, we're quiet. Now, I can tell you now, because I've done this with so many children, your children will come up with the worst possible consequences. That, it's like, oh, I'm not allowed to eat for 3 days, or I'm never allowed to be on my technology, or I can't have a bedtime story ever again, and we want to temper that. But what we're really doing is we're encouraging them to think and to make that link between, if I choose not to do this, there is going to be a consequence. And now I've got to think through what that might look like. And it means you get to kind of come in on a white charging horse and say, no, 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 Jack, I think that's far too severe a consequence. Um, and so you're then encouraging them to really think about what those consequences are and then own it. And because our children then know what the consequence is going to be, and the consequence is as close to the faffing and the not going up to bed as possible, and they're making that link, the easier it is in the moment to be able to remind our children. Now, so you do that bit, that on its own will not do it. What we then need to do several times, which is why I often recommend that if you're looking at changing a pattern of behaviour with consequences, that it's a really good idea to do it at a time where, if you're co-parenting, that your partner is around and that you have less demands, conflicting demands on you, which is for a lot of people will be a weekend. Obviously isn't the case for everyone, because some people work shifts and work weekends, but you want to enlist help. You want an environment that is not too stressful in terms of times that you need to be in and out, so that you can then, after you've had that conversation, I would say between 6 and 8 times more on that day, you are going to have a bit of a talk through. So it's just a really random. Jack's quite happily doing his thing. Jack, we talked earlier on about what the new bedtime routine was going to be, so that we can avoid all of the sort of upset. Can you just remind me again what it was that we agreed? And the idea is, what we're doing is, if our children are saying it often enough, what we're doing is consolidating it, and we are also clarifying if there are any errors. If our children have done which they can do, the older they get, the classic, it goes in one ear and out the other. And actually, I'm nodding in acknowledgement. I'm saying yes, but actually, I've not listened at all. I've not taken any of it on board. I just want to end this conversation as soon as possible, parents, so I can crack on with what I want to do, because you're always nagging me. So that's a really good way of really consolidating and clarifying. Actually, are we on the same page? And so it's like, what's the routine? And remind me, Jack, what did we agree was going to be the consequence if we didn't do that? Oh, brilliant. Okay, right. Thank you. And they don't have to have got the wording perfect, but if they have got the letter of what you're, if they've got the general theme of what you've agreed, then that's fine. We don't want to get into too much correction here. It's simply having the dual purpose of them saying it out loud, so they are reinforcing and reminding and making those connections in their brain, as well as articulating so that it's in their mind how that will then work out. So that's how the talk throughs particularly work. And what I would say is, and it depends on kind of your sort of situations in terms of the challenges, and it would actually be quite useful if people are happy to pop in the chat function any particular challenges that they are currently facing in terms of behavioural choices that their children are making, and I can talk you through consequences and also talk you through how you can look at that. But what I would say is, and this is really, I think, a really crucial thing that as parents, is that consistency is far more effective than anything else. And when we've got lots of challenges going on, and it feels like we're firefighting, is that we're then not necessarily, we're not consistent. And so if we can the one thing I would sort of encourage you to do is to really focus on one thing only, particularly around the behavioural choices. And it may be that your child is doing multiple things. You're pulling your hair out, you're frustrated about lots of things. But sometimes when we take that moment to step back and think, okay, what are the things that are really proving challenging with this child, or the dynamics between these siblings? What's the one thing that if I really focused in on that, do I think would have the biggest ripple effect and impact, so that the other things might be present, but they may not be present as badly, or those things might not be such an issue, and I could kind of not necessarily ignore them, but they would naturally fall away. Because otherwise, what you find yourself in, you're trying to change multiple things at the same time. You're inconsistent, and your child doesn't get that repeat message, um, that is specifically what you're working on. And I think from your perspective as well, it just means that often you end up with this environment at home that just feels really unpleasant, because you're kind of like, oh, and Jack, don't do this, and Jack, don't do that, rather than being able to be really clear, this is what we're working on. Because, maybe you believe that actually, because there's so much faffing and there's so much procrastinating around bedtime, that actually if they could just go to bed and be upstairs, you could get your decompression time, which helps you recharge. And actually that would mean that when you, on the next day, you're better recharged in order to be able to deal with it, and your child is also much more refreshed. And you think that some of the other things that might be happening will then not be as, you will get less of that because everyone's had some rest. So it's really focusing in on that one. So hitting siblings and parents. Okay. So with those sorts of ones, then it's about having a clear discussion around the emotion that underpins all of these behaviors, but particularly when we're talking about hitting and being physical. The emotion behind the behavioral choice is valid. Frustration, annoyance, jealousy, anger, fear, whatever is behind that is perfectly acceptable. You can feel that way, but the choice of being physical and laying hands on someone else is not okay. So it then becomes much more about problem solving and building up a tools of what can we do instead, either about communicating how we're feeling or being able to express that frustration in a more acceptable way. And some children have, I sort of view emotions as, they're an energy that needs to be outlet. So it's finding an alternate. Some children need some sort of physical thing, whether that's squeezing a stress ball, whether that's punching a pillow. For some, words are not sufficient. They need to be able to do something physical. But the consequence with those sorts of things have all got to be related to making good after, the emotional upset that causes either the parent, or the emotional upset that causes a sibling, and then making good in some way. And that's probably, if they're younger, will be a verbal apology. But when we're looking at apologies, it's framing it depending on their language and their age and stage, is about framing that it was not I'm sorry that I hit you. I was angry. You had my toy. But it's not, but I shouldn't have hit you. And I know that made you sad. It's that sort of, because that's a natural consequence. The other natural consequence to that is, as a parent, if you are then trying to resolve that matter afterwards, which you will be because there'll be upsets, then a natural consequence may well be, because they've made that choice and then that's taken time from you doing something else, that's taken time out of your day, wherever it might be, that may well have a natural consequence on a activity, a task, a thing that you are going to do, that then will be impacted. And sometimes that's a thing that you were going to do with your child that therefore can't happen. But sometimes it can also be, I've been taken away from something that I needed to do, whether that's something physically at home, whether that's something to do with work. And as a consequence, I have to find that 45 minutes again. And that might mean that I was going to do X with you, but I can't now because I need that 45 minutes to do the thing that I was supposed to have done in the time that it took me to resolve. If you've got 10 hours in a day and you lose 45 minutes and you had something that you needed to do, then again, that could be quite a legitimate explanation of, because we've spent all of this time trying to sort this out, I now need to find time to do this, rather than what we typically do, which is defer it and just say, okay, right, well, I've had to deal with this, and so that's going to have to wait till another day. Or if it's specifically we were going to go to the park, we still take our children to the park. Whereas I think it's quite reasonable to say, well, we haven't got time, or the trip to the park that was going to be with a picnic now isn't a picnic. So it's thinking about those sorts of consequences. So hopefully that helps. Meltdown, tantrum while out. Yeah. So with that one, and particularly when we've got lots of emotions that are underpinning it, with those sorts of things, I think there's a real benefit in having those conversations um, in advance. So if that has happened, now that might be a one-off, um, or it might be a repeat pattern that typically happens. But even if it is just one-off, if you're going to go somewhere, I might say, I would then have a bit of that conversation of, I've noticed that when we were at was it birthday party or soft play, that, and I don't know, I'm making it up, that you were really upset about leaving and you didn't want to go. You were having such an amazing time, and the last thing you wanted to do is to go home and get ready for bed or whatever. So what we're doing is we're having a bit of an educated guess about why that tantrum may well have happened. Maybe it was nothing to do with going home. Maybe it was something to do with somewhat, they were waiting to go on a soft play, a piece of equipment on the soft play, and someone was hogging it and they couldn't. Whatever it is, we want to try and have a bit of an educated guess around the emotion that was behind that, and also so that we can kind of pose that to them, and then say, and it's okay to to be upset that you're going to have to go. It's okay to be annoyed because someone was on that particular soft play piece that you were desperately trying to get on, but it's not okay to behave that way. And then have a conversation around the consequences. If you do that, this will be the consequence. So it may well be that we will have to leave, if because that's not the way that we respond in those situations. So we will have to leave early, or you may not get an opportunity to go and do that again. We're not trying to be horrid, but it is about helping them understand that the choice in that moment, the feeling is all right, but they make different choices. So what might they then be able to do? Do they come to you to express how they're feeling? If they're waiting for somebody, do they try and use their words? Excuse me, please, may I have a turn? And then we praise them, even if we get a child that's still hogging that particular activity. So it's about preemptively. I think sometimes we want to avoid having that conversation because we feel that if we have it, we might somehow create the tantrum. Oh my goodness, if I just ignore it, maybe that was a one-off and they won't do it again. So I'm just not going to say anything. And then, of course, we find ourselves in that situation again. And then we're frustrated with ourselves that we find ourselves in that position again. So I do think it's about having those preemptive conversations. Look, we're going to be doing this. This is what happened last time. How are we going to manage this? What are the things that we can do to help? And what might be a consequence if you persist in X or Y behavior? And then and this is where I think with consequences, you can really think in advance about what you're going to do. Because what we're trying to, it all goes back to this idea of we're trying to teach our children what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, responses to their feelings. And so that it then becomes much more instructive. So I hope that covers that. So 7-year-old hitting and bullying, 4-year-old. Yeah. So again, it goes back to the conversation that we had about I've noticed that, and this is the physical thing. What I would add to that, and particularly for anything around siblings, is two things. One is that if sibling dynamics are always going to be the case, they are always going to be fighting and arguing because they are vying for a limited resource, which is your time and your attention. It's going to happen. One of the things that we do that slightly amplifies that is we get involved and referee things that we have not seen. So I would discourage you from doing that. Yes, we all know our children. We probably can 99.9% of the time be 100% accurate as to which person is which sibling is causing the issues. However, from a child's perspective, if you have not been physically present and they are then running to you with the story of what happened, you will always, to the children, appear to be taking sides. When you've seen a sibling argument and you've seen hitting and you've seen unkindness in any shape or form, whether that's words or being physical, it's a very different. Now, they could still feel that you're taking sides, but you can be much more objective because you've seen it. So that was the first thing that I would say, because that then ends up fueling it. The other thing that's really important when we're dealing with behavioural choices with siblings is to try and also take a bit of a step back and examine what might be going on in the minds of each of the siblings. So, for example, 7-year-old boy bullying a 4-year-old sister. Now, that could just be nothing other than 7-year-old is just not managing their emotions particularly well, and we need to help and scaffold that. However, it could also be that maybe 4-year-old sister is happy-go-lucky, always cheerful, and maybe they go to preschool or they've started school, they've got lots of friends. 7-year-old really struggles with things, finds things very difficult, is not very confident. Again, it doesn't have to be what we objectively feel as parents, but this is the lens through which each child is looking at their world. And the biggest comparison that children have is with their siblings at home because they're there all of the time. So what you might be seeing is a displacement of, I'm not feeling very confident. I'm maybe not as, as content with things. And this annoying 4-year-old is like super cheerful, super happy, and it just makes me feel even worse. So the frustration that's coming is not really related to what's going on at all, but much more about the internal state. Now, that might not be the case, but there is often a lot going on in terms of the dynamics of how we see. You just think if you are listening to this and you have siblings of your own as an adult, put yourself back into that scenario with your siblings, and there would have been various different dynamics that would have played out. The lens with which you saw how, if you think the number of adults that I speak to, oh yeah, my ex-sibling was the favorite. So it's just thinking through that comes from somewhere. We have it as adults. It's come from our childhood, and so there may well be, when we're looking at the behaviour, something that might be playing out in the dynamics of how your children view themselves, accurately or inaccurately, that makes them feel that, which is why when we referee, we only make things worse. And if we haven't seen it, if we've seen it, it's a whole different ballgame. We can be we can be super objective. And it's probably exactly the same, where there's always going to be, with my children, my son was really good at his words to get under the skin of his sister. And then she would always then be the more likely to get physical. So of course he could play the whole, oh, Mom, she did this to me. But of course I knew, but if I hadn't seen it, it was much more difficult because then I could be much more objective. And so hopefully that helps with that one. So moaning, impatience, and poor attitude during family gathering or any activity. Okay. So again, that is about the conversation. And I'm wondering with that particular question, whether we're talking about a slightly older child, but I think that's a conversation around, look, I've noticed that whenever we're doing X, Y, or Z, these family gatherings, that there's a lot of complaining around it. So the conversation is about, we're going to do these things, and what is being required of you is that, yeah, preteen. Right. What is being required of you is that you are present. And part of what does being present look like in the moment? Ask them. And then the conversation, the natural consequences, if they can't and they're moaning and they're complaining about something that is really important as part of the family, then the natural consequence is that some of the things that they value and then feel that are important may not occur because they're not giving you. It's the kind of, this is, I always sort of talk about, there are some things, and it will be different across different families, that are non-negotiable. So when with my children, the thing that was an absolute non-negotiable was around bedtime and meal times. Everything else, we had conversations, but it was about the fact that we all sat together and ate meals together and had conversations, we had a very clear bedtime that happened and the routine that happened around it. Didn't mean that everything else was up for grabs and they could do whatever they wanted, but those were, for me, so crucial in my view in terms of raising them to be these resilient and confident adults, that I was there was just absolutely, they're not things that you can that we'll play around with. So we're not going to, start, I don't know, eating off on trays or having, food in bedrooms and stuff like that. That was, you will all have your own. Um, and that was part of kind of, almost like it's not the price that they pay, but it is part of that contribution towards the family. And so if you're not meeting your obligations, the fundamental obligations, and there are consequences to anything else that you then do. Everything else is a luxury, is a nice to have. And so it's reframing it. Whereas I would suspect with your preteen, what's happening is, and this is happening with lots of children, is that they view it as I'd much rather be doing it something else. And why are you making me do this? Whereas instead, when we're reframing it as this is part of your role within this family is to contribute and to be present when we are together. And therefore, this is mandatory, as is, being educated. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in a school, it can be homeschooling, but there are some things that are just mandatory. And if you can't meet the mandatory requirements, we can't start looking at the frilly stuff that you want to do, that you want to add on. So that is that sort of conversation. But obviously we're doing it in a, we're trying to explain to them so that they can understand. And particularly, I would say the dynamic changes when our children are younger. There is a bit of a power dynamic. I'm the parent, you're the child, you'll do what I ask you to do. These are the rules. When they start getting it used to be teens, but now it's preteens, and this could be, for some, could be 8. So what we then want to try and do is change the dynamic. So instead, it feels like we're having a bit more of an adult to adult conversation. And it's not that we're saying, right now, you get to choose what you go to and what you don't go to and what time you go to bed. But it's much more, I'm having a conversation with you where there's I'm trying to understand what you want. I'm trying to encourage you to understand why this is really important to us as a family. And we're going to have a negotiation and a discussion so that we can then move this forward. Whereas when we're like this with children, it's much more, there is no negotiation. This is what happens. And both have their time and their place. Often where we tend to get frictions is when we're still stuck in this and haven't realized we need to move to this. And that is not I can't tell you it happens at X age. It's much more the stage that your child is at. And some you might be doing that at 5. Sometimes you might be doing this at 5. Sometimes you might not get to this until 10. So it's just wherever your child might be with that. Naughty step or similar approach. I personally do not find that I don't feel that that's a particularly helpful strategy. And I'll explain why. When our children make poor choices, what underpins that poor choice is an emotion, and a dysregulated emotion at that, particularly hitting and other things. But in essence, if I'm feeling overwhelmed with my feelings, I am more likely to make a poor choice behaviour wise. So I'm a dysregulated child. I might not look it outwardly, but I am dysregulated. If you then remove me, I am this dysregulated child who now is alone to try and manage and make sense of what's going on in their feelings. And I don't think that then helps. And there's lots of, time in, and I'm not into sort of whatever language as such, but for me, it's much more a case of you've made a poor choice, and in that moment, and we're just going to sit with this for a while. It's about being around your child and helping them. So it's not that you need to help them physically work through it, although for some it can be really helpful, but it's just about, I'm here, I love you, you've made a poor choice, we're going to get through this, helping them just by being in the same space as them, as they then work through and then having a bit more of a conversation around how they could have made a different choice. Some children, when you do the problem solving piece, when children have made poor choices, you can, some children will say, actually, what I need really in those moments is just to be on my own. Then you're having a conversation. Okay, so Jack, when that happens, if you then hit Sophie again, how do I help you, remind you that for you, that space, you need that time on your own? Because then you're getting their permission around saying, well, maybe you need to go to your bedroom, if that's what they say that they need. But generally, I would advocate that it comes from them rather than us. I'm dysregulated and now you've pushed me away, is how they see it. So I personally have not found that particular strategy to be helpful.